I am so happy to be joined today with Dr. Jonathan Stea, an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Calgary and the author of the upcoming book, Mind the Science: Saving Your Mental Health from the Wellness Industry. Dr. Jonathan Stea and I have been connected on Twitter for quite some time. And actually, he is one of the first people to retweet my stuff and help promote what it is that I'm trying to do. So I am thrilled to have this conversation. Hi, Jonathan. How you doing today?
I'm fantastic, Melanie. I loved tweeting your stuff. It was so warranted and important, and you had such good material. So yeah, I'm so happy to be here. This has been a long time coming, chatting with you, and we also got to work together on the previous volume or previous book that I co-edited with Stephen Hupp, the current editor of the Skeptical Inquirer. So we did a chapter on energy healing, and that was a ball.
Yeah, so don't want to give away the ending, but energy healing is pretty much woo.
An understatement, but yes.
Jonathan, is there anything I missed in your bio that you want to share?
Um, yeah, I mean, I can introduce myself. So yeah, you mentioned I'm an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Calgary. That's sort of the academic appointment that I have. But my day job is a full-time clinician in a hospital setting where I help people who experience concurrent addiction and mental disorders. So people that come to our clinic have mental health and addiction concerns, and I work in a fantastic interdisciplinary team with other psychologists and social workers and psychiatrists and addiction medicine physicians and nurse practitioners. And what we get to do is uh, the honor of doing individual therapy and group therapy. Um, and I get to supervise students and residents in this area. And so I've been doing this full time for over a decade. And yeah, I also have the academic appointment at the U of C, where I also get to, sit on masters and dissertation committees and get to be at the forefront of research, watching these wonderful students kind of tell us about what they're working on. And I get to be in awe of that. And then sort of at the side of my desk, what I've been doing, much like you, has been participating in that science communication um, community. And so I've been doing that probably about the last 5 years or so. And that sort of started off writing in blogs and, op-eds and articles and doing interviews for news stories and things like that. And just realized that there's so much to say and so much misinformation and so much pseudoscience out there that I really wanted to localize it and just kind of get it out, get it all out in one place, which was sort of the seeds of this book. And that's sort of what led to me writing it.
Yeah, so I know you as a science communicator and have watched you primarily on Twitter over the last few years. Fun side, I was just thinking about how I first got introduced to you, and I think it was I had shared my article on the problem with doing your own research, and you tweeted it out, and overnight, I got thousands of hits on my website in, like, one night. That was the first time that happened. I was like, "Oh my goodness, this big account shared my stuff. This is amazing." And since then, you've been so supportive. But also, you've been showing me, what it's like to try to communicate science on social media. There is a lot of misinformation out there, and people like you are doing their best to try and help people not fall for it. And in the process, you take an obscene amount of harassment. And I guess I was just curious about your experience as a science communicator and what you've learned from that. And also, I just need to say your man bun is awesome.
Thank you so much for that. The man bun gets more heat than I do
It's
for some reason. And now I can't get rid of it because people hate it so much, or at least it's been targeted so much that I can't get rid of it because why would I? And it wouldn't well, it's here to stay. And yeah, so I think a lot of the harassment again is sort of an understatement because it's been a lot.
Mm,
Um, I would say too, just to kind of back up, I loved retweeting your stuff and kind of like doing your own research article because I just love the way that you've been your approach to science communication and just it's very non-judgmental. It's very crystal clear in the way you convey the concepts. You have art and just kind of imagery associated with it too, which I think is just fantastic, and I really envy that. And yeah, I mean, it's no wonder that it goes viral. Some of your stuff.
mm,
Um, my stuff, on the other hand, I just get a lot of hate, as we're saying. So that's for better or worse. But yeah, I mean, and I'm not the only one. A lot of people have. Tim Caulfield's another excellent science communicator. He gets it. Um, Peter Hotez, who out in the U.S., people have showed up at his house to intimidate him for all of the great research he's done in vaccines. And yeah, I've been getting a lot too. Probably for I want to say the past 2 years or so, quite literally get hundreds of hateful messages a day.
A
Um,
day?
a day. Yeah, across platforms, mostly on Twitter or now X. And it actually got a lot worse since Elon Musk took over. I mean, it was bad before, but it's terrible now. And I can't even tell if half of it are bots or so. I don't know. It's really hard to know, and but it's been going on for a while. I wrote an article about it in Scientific American. I've sort of wrote blogs about it too, and trying to help people understand the psychology of harassment and kind of the psychology of trolling. There's various reasons why people do it. There's particular personality traits that are associated with it, such as narcissism or sadism. So there's sort of these dark triad or dark tetrad traits in the field of psychology, which we know is associated with it. Also, there's a lot of kind of tribalism associated with it, and sort of people that kind of become married to pseudoscientific beliefs or particular beliefs, and that can really activate the tribalistic tendencies in us, and then so people will kind of um, let their aggression out on other people that they don't even know. And so I guess what I've been trying to do in part is I think an important message is that for the new generation, the next generation of science communicators to understand that it really does come with the territory, even when people are not making, controversial statements or tweeting or posting about controversial topics. It just sort of happens. And so I think I don't know that there's a good map for new science communicators. So it's really just important to be aware that that's a thing and to be prepared for it. Um, to understand that a lot of what people are attacking is a cartoon version of who they think you are. So I think when people are able to understand it in that way, it kind of helps to not personalize it and not personalize the attacks because they're not attacking you; they're attacking an idea of who they think you are and a very straw man sort of idea of who they think you are. I mean, so I think that's super important for people to understand and kind of because I've had a lot of people reach out to me and say, "How do you manage this?" And because they're receiving a lot of hate and harassment, and it can be very emotionally draining, especially if it happens uh, kind of spontaneously and quickly. Like if they're retweeted by a large account, they can get hundreds of messages a day of hate, and if they're not used to that, it can be really overwhelming and discombobulating. So yeah, that's one way to help people understand it is to just really not take it personally. They also want to protect their safety too. I mean, death threats and things like that aren't something to trivialize. So you need to take that stuff seriously. Um, Also, at the same time, um, at least for people that are new to it, I it usually comes in waves for people that sometimes get a lot of the hate. So I try to tell them that the internet for the most part has a short memory. So they'll get a lot of hate today, and then it tends to blow over in a day or two unless you keep retweeting or keep talking about the same topics. So yeah, it can be very um, it can be a lot, and a lot of it too. There's other reasons. I mean, those are the internal factors that kind of lead to harassment. There's the personality traits. There's the marriage to specific beliefs. But there's also kind of these external factors like the online disinhibition effect, which is just when people are behind a screen and behind a keyboard, especially if they're anonymous, well, it's almost like liquid courage, you know. And then if you pour alcohol onto that, that's like liquid courage on steroids. So I think, and you know, that, I'm not really saying that facetiously. I think, you know, alcohol is a big part of it too, because alcohol also um, decreases our inhibitions. And I think that's, you know, all of this. It's not any one factor. It's all of these factors coming together to interact into this perfect storm. And I think that explains a lot of it. There's also just sort of on a more systemic level, there's just troll farms, and there's, you know, there's actual paid trolls and people that are actually paid to um, disrupt and divide and polarize. And I think a lot of it, Peter Hotez writes a lot about this in his book, The Rise of Anti-Science, where it's basically the anti-vaccine movement sort of has these troll farms or these agents that are designed to spread misinformation and troll along the way. And that's a very real thing, and there's a scientific literature on it too. So sorry, that was a long-winded way of sort of addressing this harassment, but I think it's important.
Yeah. First of all, um, I didn't tell you this. I started to design, you said I make artwork. It, I use Canva and it's my limited skill set here, but I was starting to design an award and I was going to call it the Jonathan Stea. And no, I was going to call it the Man Bun. Um, because it's classic ad hominem, and it's honestly, it's a sign that you won in an argument. If that's all they got is to attack your man bun, then they don't have substance. But as a new science communicator, I do struggle with it. I don't take anywhere near the harassment that you do, but I take a lot of misogynistic and sexist abuse. And everything from, you know, talking down to me to commenting on my looks to, oh, lots of dumb blonde jokes. I thought I would graduate out of those from elementary school, but apparently not. Those stay with,
No, it's
yeah.
such an unsophisticated, like the ad hominems, the personal attacks, and then the man buns, it's such an unsophisticated form of tribalism that you'd see on the schoolyard.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I agree. I think women get it 10 times worse. I've talked to some other, just like you, other women science communicators, and it's horrible. Even just having my man bun, I was starting to get objectified and getting these sort of misogynistic personal attacks that come from this sort of traditional toxic masculinity kind of subset. And you know, that's only a fraction of what you get and others get. And so yeah, it's terrible. It's and there's no argument to be won. It's just it's designed to hurt.
Yes.
It's designed to have a chilling effect and to silence, essentially.
Yes.
My approach, and this is not for everyone, because a lot of people don't, again, it can be really emotional draining, and if you're not well practiced at learning how to manage it, it can be really hard on people. And so some people, the chilling effect works, and they'll sort of peel back. For me, I decided a long time ago that I'm not going to do that, and so I really do like to kind of stand up to it. I have to stand up to it in a way that's diplomatic, and I try to do my best with it. So I try to bring humor into it, and sort of, you know, address the absurdity of what they're saying. But again, that's not for everyone, and I totally get and appreciate how um, sometimes science communication is just not for everyone when they're getting so much abuse, because um, we shouldn't need to tolerate it. And we have things that are built in to social media, like the block function and muting, that can try to mitigate it, and it does help. And on the other hand, it doesn't always help. So I've blocked people that have been harassing me for almost 5 years now too. And so, and trying to defame and, you know, other things that I won't get into. But yeah, so blocking is not the only remedy. So some people will get scared away from it, and I get that.
I've appreciated your counsel on this over the years, and also um, how you highlight the abuse that you take. I think because there's a lot of people on social media who are just watching. And those are, I often joke that my science communication is for the normal, so those in the middle of the bell curve, because people over here, they don't need me. And people over here I'm not saying they can't be reached, but with my time, energy, and skill set, they're difficult to reach. But there's a lot of people in the middle, and a lot of them aren't engaging. They're spectators. And so for them to see the kinds of harassment that science communicators take, I think is really helpful to so that they know where it is that you're coming from, and the fact that you're just trying to help people not fall for misinformation and the kinds of abuse that you take for that. So I appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you. Likewise, I appreciate what you're doing as well. And, none of us deserve it. I should say too, at the same time, like, yes, there's these overwhelming, hateful messages that we receive. I also get an overwhelming amount of positive support. And that's also very uplifting, motivating, energizing, and it helps to drown out the noise. And it's fantastic. And that's another sort of coping skill that we try to encourage other science communicators who may be receiving harassment, is to lean on their social support and sort of the broader science communication community, because most of these people have gone through it. And so when you find community in that way, that in and of itself can be a coping skill, because then people realize they're not alone in it. And that, like you said, even for the spectators, a lot of people are just kind of rooting you on, and they appreciate the goal and the mission of trying to debunk misinformation and debunk pseudoscience and promote evidence-based care, because that's in the best interest of patients, that's in the best interest of themselves and their loved ones and the people they care about. So that's the goal.
So, are there any kinds of, I guess, a two-part question here, and you can answer whichever one that you like, or if there's overlap, then I've hit the target. Um, Are there any kinds of posts in particular on social media, misinformation on social media that you think are the most potentially harmful, the most believable, or I guess the most widely believed? Or um, any particular kinds of misinformation that when you address, you take the most harassment for?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think the posts that garner the most hate and that are the most kind of inflammatory, um, are the ones that where I'm addressing the anti-vaccine movement
Mm,
and or the anti-psychiatry movement, and just sort of alternative medicine grift more generally, but particularly the anti-vaccine movement. I think in part that's because they are kind of really well funded, and I think there are a lot of bots underneath that, and even if they're not bots, they're humans that are just scouring social media and actually looking for the word anti-vaccine. Like, I notice that every time if I will post the word anti-vaccine movement, I'll get flooded. And same with anti-psychiatry. I also think those are the most dangerous ones, because I mean, vaccines, we know, are one of the greatest medical miracles that we have. And so the fact that there exists a pseudoscientific movement to undermine the gains and the lives saved from vaccination is, I mean, it's terrible that we actually have to battle against this movement. And that's what Peter Hotez wrote his entire book on that, and basically the fight against that movement, and just the sheer damage that it's done in its fear mongering about autism, its fear mongering about literally everyone that dies that's not of old age. In the current media, you have someone saying that they quote unquote died suddenly from a vaccine. And it's asinine, to be frank. But it's dangerous, and it's dangerous because it can, for a lot of people, capitalize on that illusory truth effect. When you repeat lies often enough, they can start to be believable. And so we do need people to debunk this stuff and to pre-bunk it, because I think it can, and it has swayed public opinion. And again, we have research on that. There was a recent study that showed people are less likely to get their dogs vaccinated now because of the anti-vaccine misinformation that we're seeing. And so that is really worrisome and bothersome. And then for me, as a clinical psychologist, and who treats people with addiction and mental health concerns and mental disorders, my beef in particular is with the anti-psychiatry movement, and I wrote a lot about this in my book. And it parallels the anti-vaccine saga in a lot of ways, in that it's a similar sort of pseudoscientific assault, and they will, for example, get their messages heard by sharing a lot of misinformation on social media, but they'll also obviate the peer review process in certain ways. They'll publish in blogs, they'll publish in books, they'll publish on websites like Mad America, which are websites dedicated to flaming psychiatry, again, in a way that really dodges scientific critique. And so these are ways, again, to kind of sway public opinion. And I wrote about some of these in my book because there's certain anti-vaccine tropes, there's alternative medicine tropes, and then there's also anti-psychiatry tropes, or repeated slogans or sayings that aren't true. So, for example, we hear in the anti-psychiatry movement that mental illness doesn't exist at all, or that it's completely fabricated. It was made by a checklist by a bunch of men, and that all psychiatric medications are harmful and that they actually cause mental illness, or they cause certain problems. And so this is a very dangerous thing, because what it does is it serves to deter treatment seeking and to essentially fearmonger and scare people away from getting help that they need, especially people who experience mental disorders. And that's not good, because then that's quite seriously compromising patient care. And so, yeah, it's very dangerous. And I think what drives a lot of this too is that, as we know, with any kind of piece of propaganda, there's often kernels of truth to it. And then those kernels of truth can become blown up, and they can become a cartoon version of itself. And that's what kind of gets propagated. So yes, some people have been harmed by psychiatric medications, just like some people have been harmed by vaccines. That doesn't mean that the risks outweigh the benefits for the majority of people. And this goes back to why we need proper informed consent on these issues. And these are things that psychiatry itself kind of advocates for, and that's what mainstream medicine itself advocates for. But that's not what these pseudoscientific movements do, like the anti-psychiatry movement and the anti-vaccine movement. They will take a kernel of truth and just exaggerate it to the point of absurdity and sell it. And that's what propaganda does.
So the anti-psychiatry movement is kind of new to me because so not my area, and also I don't know why I'm still astonished by people's ability to not accept various aspects of reality. But this is one of those where I think, really? We're not accepting this. Okay. Um, so the basic premise, what I'm getting from you, is that mental illness does not exist. Okay. So what I'm getting in that then must be, um, was this something that started and or propagated by big pharma to make money on medications?
It's sort of born out of the idea. So the anti-psychiatry movement has a long-ish history. So it kind of came from the 1960s. And it was coined by David Cooper in 1967, the anti-psychiatry, the term anti-psychiatry, but it started a bit earlier than that. Thomas Saz was a psychiatrist who wrote a book called The Myth of Mental Illness. And so it started out, with a lot of self-identified disgruntled psychiatrists in that area. And a lot of it was pushback and against psychiatry's missteps. So there was inhumane treatment of people in asylum care. There was inappropriate pathologizing of minority groups. And with respect to this trope about mental illness not existing, it was really, we're trying to sort it out. The brain is super complex. And so it comes from the idea that we don't understand psychopathology and mental disorders 100%. And so at all, it's a very, very complicated area of study. And so we've been trying to understand it for a long time. And so in the 1960s, the anti-psychiatry movement kind of developed. And at first it was very helpful, and it actually helped push psychiatry to become a more scientific endeavor, adopting what we call a biopsychosocial model. So trying to pay attention more to the not just the biological aspects of mental illness, but also the psychological and the social contributions and how they interact. So it helped push, so the anti-psychiatry movement pushed psychiatry to become more scientific and to become more humane. And that was really great. And, that was psychiatry basically got its act together. And that's fantastic. The problem is that the anti-psychiatry movement is a movement that outlasted its own cause or merit. And so now it's really basically it exists as this sort of disorganized entity, largely outside of academia, and it's or outside of mainstream medicine, and it's given breath by these different lifelines. So, I mean, the most famous one is sort of Scientology, but that's sort of a minor player in the game. But yeah, Scientology is sort of the cult of Scientology, which has a lot of anti-psychiatry propaganda. There's a museum that I visited in LA, the CCHR, Anti-Psychiatry Museum of Death. And the CCHR was co-founded by Thomas Szasz, who initially founded the anti-psychiatry movement in part, and Scientology. So they have kind of their roots in Scientology. But then there's also these subfields called what we call critical psychology or critical psychiatry. And they are they use something called critical theory to look at various topics. So trying to understand things from the viewpoint of power dynamics and it's a philosophical approach, kind of rooted in Michel Foucault's work. But anyways, there's a group of it's a group of again self-identified disgruntled psychologists and psychiatrists and journalists and reporters who will identify as critical psychologists or psychiatrists. The problem is that they don't, in my opinion, they don't offer anything new or groundbreaking that's not already addressed by psychiatry. And then, of course, the other lifeline that we have from anti-psychiatry is patients or consumers who have been harmed by psychiatric medications, just like the anti-vaccine movement. And it's a very tragic thing. And the problem when you have a movement like this is that you'll have all of these sort of groups of people coming online, and they will be sharing misinformation about topics that they're quite frankly not qualified to understand. And it can be a very delicate thing to talk about because we have to hold empathy for people that have been hurt by it, and we have to help these folks. And that's a very important and real topic. At the same time, we can't tolerate propaganda and misinformation, such as all psychiatric medications are harmful and mental illness doesn't exist, and that psychiatry should be abolished, and that your psychiatrists are just shills for big pharma, and that they're out to hurt you. So that's where the nuance gets lost. And when we go to online spaces where people are discussing psychiatry, it can become inflammatory, and people can feel like their lived experiences are invalidated. Mental health professionals can feel attacked, and then lost in that space, basically anecdotal evidence is amplified by both parties. And then in that space just becomes a breeding ground for misinformation. And so that's where that sort of comes from. And so kind of back to your initial question, this idea, well, how the hell can mental illness not exist? Of course it exists. The reality is that real academics, psychologists and psychiatrists, are still trying to carve nature at its joints, so to speak, because we're not good at it. We have the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it's like a really terrible map because it's not the best thing that we have. It's pretty terrible in a lot of ways, and there's entire researchers devoted full time to elucidating psychopathology and trying to sort this out. Careers are based on this. This has been happening for decades. We're trying to get a better understanding of it. Right now, we use the DSM to diagnose mental disorders. And again, it's a terrible map, but it's better than no map. And it's better than saying that mental illness doesn't exist. You can't deny things like psychotic disorders, or bipolar disorder, or obsessive compulsive disorder, things that have real biological, psychological, and social components. And so the arguments in academia really come, well, how do we best identify and treat people with these disorders. People in anti-psychiatry will, again, take a cartoon or straw man version of these things and basically say, well, we're just pathologizing normal human experience. It can all be reduced to distress or trauma, and that these things don't really exist. And the only reason they do exist is so that we can medicate people and keep them as slaves. And then it's tied to whatever conspiracy theory that they might pitch. So again, sorry, long-winded way of trying to describe the anti-psychiatry movement and its harm.
No, that's wowzers. Okay, because I heard a lot of things in there, and I'm still trying to put them together in my brain. One of the characteristics of science denial is a demand for impossible expectations. And so what I heard in there is our knowledge isn't perfect, therefore it must all be wrong, or insert whatever pseudoscience we want to believe.
Yes.
But also, like um, I heard victim blaming. So people who have mental illnesses, like, so how would someone, like, let's say somebody suffers from depression, but according to anti-psychiatry, this is not real. So why are they not well?
Yeah, I mean, anti-psychiatry, they can't properly account or describe or explain mental illness because what they'll do is we call it psychosocial reductionism. So they'll reduce basically all mental disorders that we would describe as mental disorders. That what I've seen is that they'll reduce it to distress. They'll say it's normal human distress, or that it's normal human experiences that we all have. That'll apply to depression. They'll even apply it to, say, hearing voices if you have schizophrenia, right, or some sort of psychotic disorder. And they'll say that what we shouldn't be doing is medicating them, and that we should be addressing the trauma or the distress. And again, in part, that's kind of true because that's what we literally do as evidence-based health professionals. We are treating the whole person. We're taking a biopsychosocial approach to treatment. We're addressing biological, psychological, and social factors. What anti-psychiatry does is they take the brain out of the picture. They take the bio out because they say that there is no bio. Essentially, that's what a lot of their arguments come down to. And what they also do is they'll they'll describe that as a common denominator, that distress and trauma is the common denominator of all mental disorders. And again, that's a vastly oversimplification. Not everyone that experiences trauma develops a psychopathology. And so they just to simplify it, they don't know how to account for it. And so they'll end up repeating these tropes, but when you dig deeper, there's no substance to it. They can't properly account for it. The models that we have, the ideological models, or the what's called the explanations that we have for mental disorders, take into account all of these different risk factors: biological, psychological, and social.
So
And yeah, go ahead.
let me ask it, because I've seen some of the questions that you take on social media. So I'm just going to get this out there. Um, when someone comes to see you, all you do is medicate them, and then you collect your check from Big Pharma?
That'd be nice. The amount of times that I've been told that I'm a big pharma show. Like, where's that
So what
money?
is wrong in everything I just said? Is your first inclination to just throw pills at people and then collect your check from Big Pharma?
Well, the vast majority of clinical psychologists like me don't even prescribe medication. I'm not licensed to prescribe medication. And so that's the thing. I have a PhD. I don't have an MD, and MDs are who prescribe medication. So that would be psychiatrists. Nurse practitioners can do it too. Some psychologists with additional training, mostly in the US, can also do it. I don't. None of my colleagues do it. I've never met a psychologist who's done it. So no, I don't prescribe that. At the same time, I do work on a fantastic interdisciplinary team. So when people come to us and they experience severe mental disorders and addiction, we take an evidence-based approach to see what are the first line evidence-based treatments that these people may benefit from. If it is medication, I'm sitting in a room with a psychiatrist, and we're collaborating with the patient to figure out the best approach.
Hmm. Okay, so check still in the mail, I'm assuming.
Uh, yes.
Mine is lost. I honestly, like, I don't even know who I'm shilling for, but I'm a shill for some.
Yeah.
So what motivated you to write the book? Are there any major myths that bothered you the most, or um, yeah.
Yeah. The motivation, I think, like you, and kind of what motivates your advocacy and your work just kind of stems from the fact that there's so much misinformation and pseudoscience out there. And um, again, I've just been doing it for 5 years, and I people have been inboxing, emailing me, and I look at my DMs, and they're asking me things like, Jonathan, is this guy a quack? Is this article legit? Is this treatment pseudoscientific? And I'm trying to help people develop the kind of science literacy and mental health literacy skills um, to detect the grift on their own. But there's only so many messages that I can answer, and so I that's sort of what motivated the book, was to really um, localize it and put it all in one place so that people can be better prepared to protect themselves from this kind of grift that we see in the wellness industry and from the anti-psychiatry movement and even the anti-vaccine movement, so that they can take their mental health in their own hands, and that can be really empowering and emboldening. And that's the main driver of the book, because I think, just kind of going back to what you were saying before, that's how we have these gaps in knowledge. And that's true, that cuts across all areas of medicine and all areas of science. Like, obviously science keeps going, it's incomplete. And the problem is that we have these gaps in our knowledge, and we have these gaps in our treatments, because not everyone benefits from evidence-based treatment. We know that it would be wonderful to improve our treatments. The problem is that the wellness industry is bedfellows with the anti-psychiatry movement and with the anti-vaccine movement. And you'll see that everywhere that you go, and you see these movements. So they'll say something like psychiatric medications doesn't exist, or vaccines are harmful. Come use my alternative medicine detox, or have these supplements, or do some energy healing, or do some homeopathy or naturopathy. That's the real cure. And so what they're doing is, they're not addressing the gaps that we have in our knowledge. They're just filling it with this pseudoscientific crap. and that's and it's harmful. It's not trivial. It can really harm people. It can harm people directly as a result of the treatments. It can harm people indirectly by wasting their time and their resources. And then it can even harm them more broadly at a societal level by kind of engendering this distrust that we see in mainstream medicine at large. And so the wellness industry is capitalizing, quite literally, on our gaps in knowledge. And I think that was another big motivator to write the book, because I wanted people to understand that the best offense is the best defense, so to speak. I wanted to help people defend themselves from this kind of grift, and say that, yes, we need better science, we need better ethical care, we need better access and availability to evidence-based treatments. But that's not a reason for wellness grifters to fly in and swoop in and slither in like a snake and sell your loved one a treatment that won't work and that could harm them.
Yeah. And I'm always astonished by the tactics that the alternative medicine industry uses. Because it's a lot of, it seems to me like projection, but I guess I'm talking to a psychologist. So, is it in fact projection?
Yeah, they're projecting their own insecurities, and they're basically accusing others of that which they're doing.
Oh, and also I called you a psychologist. You're a
Yeah,
psychiatrist.
I'm a clinical psychologist. Yeah,
Psychologist.
we're
So,
the ones who don't prescribe.
there you go.
Yeah,
Sorry. Um,
mostly.
again, my ignorance in this area, which actually comes back to like, we all have our areas of expertise are pretty narrow, and so like, my area of expertise is nowhere near. I can't wait to read your book because I'm going to learn so much from it. It's impossible for any one person to know all of these things, and so we depend on reliable sources of information. But when these grifters come in and try and give us false hope and tell us that other people are just out to take advantage of us and just want to sell us useless things that are going to harm us. sometimes it can be really difficult to tell who to trust and who not to trust. And the wellness industry in particular, they say, well, so and so just wants your money, but also buy my product. Um, this one over here, they're like, look at all those side effects. Well, we actually know about those side effects. That's why we're telling you these, because we know them through testing, and we have to tell you. The lack of side effects over here don't mean they don't exist. It means we either don't know or they don't have to tell you. And they'll say, well, don't trust them because, and so it's just a lot of exploiting people's needs for hope, for answers, and and throwing shade while not actually providing real solutions.
Yes, perfectly described. I mean, that it is projection. One of the one of the arguments that I make in the book is that alternative medicine is not just a set of unsupported therapies or pseudoscientific therapies. It's not just this set. It's more than that. It's an entire ideology, which
Mhm.
means it has its own beliefs associated with it, its own propaganda tactics, its own tropes. And so, and for that ideology to succeed, it requires this polarizing, divisive narrative against mainstream medicine. That's why when you Google any local alternative medicine clinic, you will find things like these alternative medicine tropes that I'm alluding to. So it'll say something like, unlike mainstream medicine, we address the root cause. We don't just mask the symptoms. Our treatments are natural, unlike the mainstream medicine where their treatments are synthetic. So all of these tropes are there, and that's what I do in the book. And so when you do read my book, you're going to read about yourself because I used I
Oh,
interviewed you for it, number
yes.
one, but I also republished um, one of your class assignments that you had because I thought it was just so brilliant. Where basically you could speak to it more than myself, but basically you had your students come up with an alternative medicine advertisement so that they could better prepare themselves for how to spot these tropes. And so I republished, I think it was Dr. Miracle's alternative medicine cure. And so if you look at this image of it, you'll see that it says, we address the root cause. Our treatments are 100% natural. Our treatments are safer. Um, there's no side effects, etc. And so I thought that was such a brilliant assignment that you did for your class. And so that's why I interviewed you, and that's why I also brought it into my book, because I think it's so important for the general public to be able to spot and identify these tropes in a way that makes it impossible for them to unsee when they say Google a local alternative medicine website. Because when they see those tropes, what they're seeing is the ideology. They're seeing the alternative medicine narrative, not just that set of unsupported therapies. And that is what I think is so dangerous because, like you said, it capitalizes on people's insecurities and the fact that maybe mainstream medicine isn't meeting all of their needs because it can't, because we have gaps in knowledge and gaps in our treatments. So instead, they prey upon that vulnerability and essentially they exploit our vulnerabilities emotionally and financially.
Yes, yes, and yes. My technique tends to be trying to save people from falling down the rabbit hole. Um, it's really hard to rescue someone once they've really bought into these things, and people's identities tend to get quite wrapped up around them. And so, I guess who is your audience for this book?
Like you mentioned earlier, it's similar to your audience. It's the general public. I think when the World Health Organization made a message for science communicators several years ago, but they basically said, like you were saying, that the audience of a science communicator is the general public. It's not the ideologically possessed, so to speak. That
Mhm.
wasn't their term, but
Oh,
that's what it
Timothy
means.
Caulfield says that, right?
Yeah, he says that all the time as well. He's taking the World Health Organization's message as well. So that's who we're targeting. We're targeting the everyday person, and we know debunking works on that population level.
Mm.
It's much harder to do. It's not impossible, but it's much harder to do for people that are completely married to their beliefs. And again, on some level, we all do this, as your work speaks to as well. We all engage in motivated reasoning processes that make us want to, fall victim to we all have personal biases, we all have confirmation bias. But there does seem to be a subset of people that even in the face of overwhelming counter evidence, they just won't change their belief. And so that's not the target audience for my book. The target audience for my book is the general public, so that they can just feel better prepared to identify what pseudoscience looks like. Basically, I wanted to teach the language of pseudoscience so that they know what to seek and what to avoid. And so, yeah, similar audience.
So, in your book, are there chapters on specific types of pseudoscience? Are you, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I have a chapter kind of devoted. What is it? Chapter 7, I think. It's devoted to, I call it exposing bunk, I think. So it's basically trying to describe a lot of different pseudoscientific approaches that have been targeted towards treating mental health concerns. It gets murky, as you know, because pseudoscience, again, is not it's a complex topic, and so it's not the case that we necessarily identify as something pseudoscientific or not. It really kind of lies on a spectrum, or it's really a task of probability. So we talk about warning signs of pseudoscience, and the more warning signs that we see, the more likely it is that we've unearthed something that's pseudoscientific. And so I do talk about in the book about some unequivocal cases of pseudoscientific treatments like energy healing and homeopathy, where absolutely these things are pseudoscientific, and I explain why. But then there also does exist this gray zone of treatments where there might be some pseudoscientific features, and there might be some bad science to kind of back it up, but they're more scientifically plausible. Like they actually have mechanisms that could work. So things like cannabis or psychedelics or something called EMDR. Like there's different treatments that may fall under this rubric, which could cross the threshold into an evidence-based treatment at some point. But right now, they're just hampered by pseudoscientific features and bad science. And so I do have a chapter kind of devoted to that to help people spot it. The problem is that it becomes a game of whack-a-mole, because when you look at the wellness industry, there's been some estimates that there's at least 600 brands of psychotherapy. 600 brands. I've never seen
Right.
600 brands. So like all of these things are just kind of popping up. And so I think more important than debunking particular pseudoscientific treatments is learning the underlying features of what makes something pseudoscientific, so that that better prepares us to identify it when it pops up. Because next week, there's going to be a new brand of psychotherapy that's pitched towards people. And I want people to know how to evaluate that through a science literacy lens.
Yeah. Oh, this is the stuff I get super excited about, because when I when I focus on getting people to not fall for misinformation, there's two things there. There's the characteristics of the misinformation itself, and being able to spot those can be helpful. But we also have to know our own vulnerabilities to various types of misinformation. What makes us susceptible to falling for something? And that takes like vigilance and conscious effort. And I use the what's the harm question, like what is the harm that might come from not thinking through this and falling for something that's not actually effective. I don't know if that actually works. That's the way I tend to do it. But when it coming to mental health, I mean, there's real harm from not addressing, not having your mental health properly cared for.
Totally. And that's in part why I love your work so much, is trying to help people identify this misinformation. And it's the hardest part, because it's not, science communication has moved away from the skills deficit model, meaning that it's not just a lack of science literacy skills or mental health literacy skills, because those things can be taught. We can teach people science literacy and mental health literacy, but it's the it's the psychological and cultural contributions to misinformation that is much more difficult to address. And that for all of us, because we all have these personal biases and we all have these belief systems. And so whenever we look at a piece of information, it's filtered through those lenses. And so that's why we need to be especially attuned to our personal biases, to what our belief systems are, to embrace this intellectual humility that embodies the scientific spirit. But that's all great and abstract. What I'm saying is, like, how the hell do you do that when you have a treatment in front of you, or you have a loved one in front of you that needs treatment? So that is a lot of the hard work to do.
Well, Jonathan, I appreciate everything that you've done for me and everything that you're doing for promoting science literacy and helping people understand how to not be fooled. Depending on when you're watching it, so the link for the book is in the description. Pre-order it now. If it's already out, order it now. I'm so looking forward to reading this book. Thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else you want to say?
Just thank you to you. I appreciate your advocacy too, all of your work, and for chatting with me about this stuff. It's super important, and I'm glad that I feel fortunate that we both have a platform to do this and to get the word out. So thank you.
Well, I owe my platform in part to you, so I'm just going to turn it back and say thank you. You've done so much help for me along the way, and thank you for your guidance.
You.
If you like this video, please like, subscribe, share. Thank you so much for your time and your support, and buy Jonathan Stea's book. Thank you.
Please.